believe his eyes. Then Mr. Strong carried the barn above his head down to the river, and he turned the barn upside down. Then he lowered it into the river so that it filled up with water. Then, and this showed how strong Mr. Strong really was, he picked it up and carried it back to the blazing corn. Mr. Strong emptied the upside-down barn full of water over the flame. Sizzle, sizzle, sputter, sputter. 1 minute, the flames were leaping in the air. The next minute, they'd gone. "However can I thank you?" the farmer asked Mr. Strong. "Oh, there's nothing," remarked Mr. Strong modestly. "But I must find some way to reward you," said the farmer. "Well," said Mr. Strong, "you're a farmer, so you must keep chickens." "Yes, I do," said the farmer. "Lots." "And chickens lay eggs," went on Mr. Strong. "And I rather like eggs." "Then you shall have as many eggs as you can carry," said the farmer, and took Mr. Strong over to the farmyard. Mr. Strong said goodbye to the farmer and thanked him for the eggs, and the farmer thanked him for helping. Then Mr. Strong, just using one finger, picked up the eggs and went home. Mr. Strong put the eggs carefully down on his kitchen table and went to close the kitchen door. The door fell off its hinges. "Whoops," said Mr. Strong, sat down. The chair fell to bits. "Whoops," said Mr. Strong, started cooking his lunch. And for lunch, he was starting with eggs, followed by an egg or two. You had an egg between eggs, and an egg on the side, and an egg for luck, and then egg. And then for his pudding, he was having, well, can you guess? For his pudding, he was having ice cream. It was a warm, sunny morning. In his small house at the other side of the wood, Mr. Tickle was asleep. You didn't know that there was such a thing as a tickle, did you? Oh, well, there is. Tickles are small and round, and they have arms that stretch and stretch and stretch. Extraordinarily long arms. Mr. Tickle was fast asleep. He was having a dream. It must have been a very funny dream, because it made him laugh out loud, and that woke him up. He sat up in bed, stretched his extraordinarily long arms, and yawned an enormous yawn. Tickle felt hungry, so do you know what he did? He reached out one of his extraordinarily long arms, opened the bedroom door, reached down the stairs, opened the kitchen door, reached into the kitchen cupboard, opened the biscuit tin, took out a biscuit, brought it back upstairs, and back to Mr. Tickle. As you can see, it's very useful indeed, having arms as long as Mr. Tickle. Mr. Tickle munched his biscuit. He looked out of the window. Today looks very much like a tickling day, he said to himself. So, later that morning, after Mr. Tickle had made his bed and cooked his breakfast, he set off through the wood. As he walked along, he kept his eyes very wide open, looking for somebody to tickle, looking for anybody to tickle. Eventually, Mr. Tickle came to a school. There was nobody about, so, reaching up his extraordinarily long arms to a high window ledge, Mr. Tickle pulled himself up and peeked in through the open window. Inside, he could see a classroom. There were children sitting at their desks and a teacher writing on the blackboard. Mr. Tickle reached in through the window with that extraordinarily long arm of his, went up behind a little boy called Peter, and tickled him on the back of his neck. Peter giggled out loud. "Stop that giggling at once," said the teacher sternly. Mr. Tickle waited a minute, then reached in through the window again. Mr. Tickle's extraordinarily long arm went right up to the teacher, paused, and then tickled. The teacher jumped in the air and turned round very quickly to see who was there. But there was nobody there. Mr. Tickle grinned a mischievous grin. He waited another minute and then tickled the teacher again. This time he kept on tickling, until soon the teacher was laughing out loud and saying, "Oh, stop it! Stop it, Odin! Stop it!" over and over and over again. All the children were laughing too at such a funny sight. There was a terrible pandemonium. Eventually, Mr. Tickle thought he'd had enough fun, so he gave the teacher one more tickle for luck, and very quietly brought his arm back through the open window. Chuckling to himself, he jumped down from the window, leaving the poor teacher to explain what it was all about, which of course he couldn't. Then Mr. Tickle went to town. And what a day Mr. Tickle had. He tickled the policeman on traffic duty at the crossroads in the middle of the town. It caused an enormous traffic jam. He tickled the greengrocer just as he was piling apples neatly in his shop window. The greengrocer fell over backwards, and the apples rolled all over the shop. There were apples everywhere. At the railway station, the guard was about to wave his flag for the train to leave. As he lifted his arm in the air, Mr. Tickle tickled him. And every time he tried to wave his flag, Mr. Tickle tickled him, and tickled him again, until the train was 10 minutes late, and all the passengers were absolutely furious. That day, Mr. Tickle tickled everybody. He tickled the doctor. He tickled the butcher. He even tickled old Mr. Stamp, the postman, who dropped all his letters into a puddle. Then Mr. Tickle went home. Sitting in his armchair in his small house at the other side of the wood, he laughed and laughed and laughed every time he thought about all the people he'd tickled. Oh, dear. Oh, Mr. Bounce was very small, and like a rubber ball, he just couldn't keep himself on the ground. He bounced all over the place. And, as you can imagine, that made things rather difficult. Last week, for instance, Mr. Bounce was out walking when he came to a farm. Climbed over the farm gate, and you can guess what happened next, can't you? He jumped down from the gate and bounced right into the duck pond. Quack! Went the ducks. The other morning, for instance, Mr. Bounce was in bed. Woke up, jumped out of bed, and guess what happened next, can't you? He bounced right out of his bedroom door and all the way downstairs. Bouncety, 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 bounce. That happens quite often, which probably explains why Mr. Bounce leaves his bedroom door open every night. After he picked himself up, Mr. Bounce went and sat down to think. Mr. Bounce bounced off the chair and banged his head on the seat. Ouch! Mr. Bounce. Oh, this is ridiculous. Mr. Bounce thought to himself, rubbing his head. I must do something to stop all this bouncing about. He thought and thought. I know, thought. I'll go and see the doctor. So, after breakfast, Mr. Bounce set off to the nearest town to see the doctor. He was passing a tennis court when he tripped over a pebble. And he bounced right onto the court where two children were playing tennis. And you can guess what happened next, can't you? The children didn't realize that Mr. Bounce wasn't a tennis ball and started hitting him with their tennis racket. Backwards and forwards over the net. Oh! Ow! Ouch! Poor Mr. Bounce. Eventually, one of the children hit Mr. Bounce so hard, he bounced right out of the tennis court. Mr. Bounce bounced off down the road towards the town. Oh dear, he said, feeling very sorry for himself. I've been bounced black and blue. The bus was coming down the road. Mr. Bounce decided that the safest place for him to be would be on it. He got on, sat down, still feeling more than a little sorry for himself. The bus drove into town. The bus stopped right outside the doctor's. Mr. Bounce stepped down from the bus and onto the pavement and bounced in through the doctor's window. Dr. Makuwell was sitting at his desk enjoying his mid-morning cup of coffee. Mr. Bounce sailed through the open window. Smash went the coffee. Ow! Squeaked Mr. Bounce. Coffee was rather hot. Good heavens! Exclaimed Dr. Makuwell. After the doctor had fished Mr. Bounce out of his coffee and set him on some blotting paper to dry out, he listened to what Mr. Bounce had to tell him. So, you see, said Mr. Bounce finally, you must give me something to stop me bouncing about all over the place quite so much. Pondered the doctor. After some thought, Dr. Makuwell went to his medicine cabinet and took out a pair of tiny red boots. This should do the trick, he told Mr. Bounce. Heavy boots. That should stop the bouncing. Oh, thank you, Dr. Makuwell, said Mr. Bounce, and walked home wearing his red boots. No, not bounced. Walked. Walked home wearing his red boots. No, not bounced. Walked. That night, Mr. Bounce went to bed wearing his heavy boots. And then he went to sleep. Following morning, he woke up, yawned, stretched, and bounced out of bed. And he went straight through the bedroom floorboards. And finished up in the kitchen. It was one of those beautiful summer mornings that everybody likes to see. In Forget-Me-Not Cottage, the owner was fast asleep, Mr. Forgetful. He was having a dream. Then the sun streaming through the windows woke up Mr. Forgetful. He yawned, stretched his arms, and tried to remember what he'd been dreaming about. But of course he couldn't. Because Mr. Forgetful can't remember anything. Anything at all. Ever. Mr. Forgetful got out of bed and went to wash his face. But he'd forgotten where the bathroom was in his house. Do you know what he did? He walked into the wardrobe. Oh, silly me, he giggled to himself. Eventually, of course, Mr. Forgetful found his bathroom and washed his face. He even remembered to clean his teeth. Then he went downstairs to make himself some breakfast. He toasted some bread. But, of course, he forgot about it. And it was burnt. He boiled himself an egg. But, of course, he forgot about it, and it was hard-boiled. Mr. Forgetful had burnt toast and hard-boiled eggs for breakfast every day. It was such a lovely day, Mr. Forgetful decided to walk down to the village to buy a stamp for a letter he'd written 3 weeks ago but had forgotten to post. So off he set. And did he remember to shut the door of Forget-Me-Not Cottage behind him? Of course he did. Morning, Mr. Forgetful, said Mrs. Parcel in the village post office. What can I do for you this fine morning? Oh, I'd like... I forgot, he said. A stamp? Suggested Mrs. Parcel, looking at the letter Mr. Forgetful was carrying. Yes, a stamp. Yeah, that's what I was trying to remember not to forget. Said Mr. Forgetful. Mrs. Parcel smiled. She was used to Mr. Forgetful. Mr. Forgetful had some more shopping to do, but could he remember what it was that he was supposed to remember not to forget to shop for? Of course he couldn't. So he decided to go home. On his way, he met the village policeman going the other way. "Morning, Mr. Forgetful," said the policeman. "You give Farmer Fields a message from me on your way home, please." Farmer Fields had a farm not very far from Forget-Me-Not Cottage. "Tell him there's a sheep loose in the lane," said the policeman. Poor Mr. Forgetful. He'd never had a message to remember in his life before. "There's a sheep loose in the lane," he said to himself, trying to remember the message as he hurried along. "There's a sheep loose in the lane. There's a sheep loose in the lane. There's a sheep loose in the lane. There's a sheep loose in the lane." Mr. Forgetful repeated the message over and over to himself. Eventually, he arrived at the farm and found Farmer Fields. "Mr. Fields," he said, there's a goose asleep in the rain." Farmer Fields couldn't believe his ears. "A goose asleep in the rain?" repeated Farmer Fields slowly. "But I don't have any geese. And anyway, it isn't raining." "Are you sure that was the message?" Poor Mr. Forgetful. He got it all wrong. And he couldn't remember how to get it all right. Simply couldn't remember at all. So off he went home. Poor Mr. Forgetful. Mr. Forgetful walked away from Farmer Fields' farm, feeling very sorry for himself. I don't remember things. He was so busy feeling sorry for himself that he didn't see that there was a sheep loose in the lane. He bumped into it and fell over. Bother! Bah! How silly letting a sheep loose in the lane, thought Mr. Forgetful. And then he remembered the message. He jumped up and ran back along the lane to the farm as fast as he could. "Mr. Field! Mr. Field!" he called as he ran into the farmyard. "Mr. Field! There's a goose asleep in the rain." He'd forgotten again. Mr. Field scratched his head. "Come with me. Come on," cried Mr. Forgetful, and pulled Farmer Fields back along the lane until they came to the sheep that was loose. "There it is," cried Mr. Forgetful. A goose!" And then he stopped. "Oh dear," he said, "No, it's not a goose, is it? That's a sheep." He blushed. "I think," smiled Farmer Fields, "that you're the goose." And he chuckled. Even the sheep started to laugh. It was so funny. Later that day, Mr. Forgetful sat down in his favourite armchair in Forget-Me-Not Cottage to think about what a funny day it had been. And he giggled and giggled the more he thought about that goose asleep in that goose asleep in the train. Oh dear. He'd forgotten again. This is the sad story of Mr. Bump. The trouble was that Mr. Bump just could not help having little accidents. If there was something for Mr. Bump to bump into, he'd bump into it all right. For instance, if you were to see Mr. Bump walking down the street in your town, and if there happened to be something to bump into down that street, then you know what would happen, don't you? Bump! Mr. Bump was just the same at home. He lived in an extremely nice home. But even there, he couldn't help having those little accidents. For instance, one morning when Mr. Bump went outside his house, he noticed that the chimney pot had come loose in a storm the night before. I must fix that before it falls off, thought Mr. Bump to himself. And he hurried off to his garden shed to fetch a ladder. very long ladder. Mr. Bump walked up the garden path with the ladder on his shoulder. He turned the corner of the garden path. Crash with the living room window. Thought Mr. Bump. And he turned to see what had happened. Crash with the kitchen window behind him. Oh dear, thought Mr. Bump again. And he rested the ladder against the wall of the house so that he could climb up onto the roof to mend the chimney pot. Crash with the bedroom window. So you can see how Mr. Bump had his little accidents. Mr. Bump had had many jobs, but somehow they never seemed to last very long. As soon as anything got lost, or broken, or splintered, chipped, or snapped, or cracked, or torn, or burst, wrenched, crunched, or split, or slit. Guess who got the blame? For instance, when Mr. Bump worked on a farm. He tripped over the farm dog and spilt the milk. The farm cat lapped it up. For instance, when Mr. Bump was a postman, he got his hand stuck in the pillar box. They had to fetch the fire brigade to come and set him free. For instance, when Mr. Bump was a carpenter, he found that when he was hammering nails, he hammered his thumb most of the time, and the nail hardly at all. In order to recover from this series of rather unfortunate happenings, Mr. Bump decided to go away for a holiday. There, he could think about what sort of job he could do where he wouldn't be such a nuisance to everybody. So, he set off to the station to catch a train to the seaside. While Mr. Bump was on holiday, several things happened. For instance, he fell off a boat into the sea, and the lifeboat had to come and rescue him. For instance, one day when he was quietly walking along the beach, minding his own business, he got his foot stuck in a bucket. And as he couldn't get it off, he had to hop round with it on his foot for hours. And as he hopped along the beach, he hopped straight into a large hole that somebody had dug. And he had to stay there all night because he couldn't climb out on his own. However, despite all these little accidents, Mr. Bump enjoyed his holiday. And while he was there, he had a splendid idea about what sort of a job he should do. It was quite the best idea Mr. Bump had ever had. An absolutely splendid idea. And now, Mr. Bump works happily for Mr. Barley, the farmer. Mr. Barley has rather a large apple orchard on his farm, and that's where Mr. Bump works. Mr. Bump's job is picking apples. But he doesn't use a ladder to climb up the tree to pick the apples, like other apple pickers. Oh, no. No, Mr. Bump has a much better way of picking apples than that. He just walks about. And before long, Mr. Bump, being Mr. Bump, walks into a tree. Down falls an apple. And Mr. Bump catches it. This makes the job of picking apples much easier. Mr. Bump is very pleased about his new job, and Mr. Bar is very pleased about his new apple picker. So, you see, the story of Mr. Bump isn't such a sad story after all, is it? Ooh. Mr. Fussy was fussy about everything. Absolutely everything had to be neat and tidy and in its proper place. Mr. Fussy spent all day and every day rearranging his furniture and making sure that the flowers grew in a straight line in his garden and trying to find specks of dust where there couldn't possibly be specks of dust, because he spent all his time making sure that there weren't any specks of dust. One fine morning, Mr. Fussy was having breakfast. He was very fussy about what he ate. He opened the marmalade pot. "Ooh," he exclaimed, "it's got bits in it." And he spent the rest of the morning separating the bits from the marmalade. Or, if you prefer, marmalade from the bits. Fussy old fusspot, people used to call him. Then Mr. Fussy went out into his garden, and he spent the rest of the day straightening out all the blades of grass on his lawn. The old fusspot. That evening, Mr. Fussy was in his kitchen, ironing his shoelaces, when he heard a crash outside. "What's to do?" he murmured to himself, and hurried outside to investigate. There, with a broken garden gate in one hand, and an old battered suitcase in the other, and a sheepish grin on his face, stood an untidy person, Mr. Clumsy. "Whoops," he said, holding up the garden gate. "It came off in my hand." "Who," spluttered Mr. Fussy, looking in horror at his garden gate, "are you?" "Oh, I'm Mr. Clumsy," replied the untidy person, grinning. And he stepped forward to shake Mr. Fussy's hand, and tripped over and fell on the lawn. "My grass!" cried Mr. Fussy. "My straight grass! You bent it!" He got down on his hands and knees and started straightening the grass. "But who are you?" he asked over his shoulder. "Why are you here?" "Oh, I'm your cousin, Flo," replied Mr. Clumsy. "Your long-lost cousin from Australia. I've come to visit." "If you look hard, there is a certain family likeness between them, isn't there?" "Well, aren't you pleased to see me?" continued Mr. Clumsy cheerfully, knocking over a flower or two as he got up. Picked up his suitcase, knocking over another flower or two, or three. Mr. Fussy quite obviously wasn't pleased to see him. "Oh, you better come in," he muttered. "I say," remarked Mr. Clumsy, looking through the front door of Mr. Fussy's house. "I say, what a neat little place you got here." He stepped inside, pushed over his shoelaces. He often done. Knocked over a chair, dropped his suitcase, and fell in an untidy heap on the floor. "Whoops," he said. Mr. Fussy shut his eye, and heaved a sigh, and groaned silently to himself. Later that evening, after Mr. Fussy had cooked them a meal, and after Mr. Clumsy had helped with the washing up, 2 broken plates, they sat down to talk. Mr. Fussy sat, as he always did, in a neat and tidy fashion, Mr. Clumsy sat, as he always did, in a not-so-neat and tidy fashion. "How long are you staying?" asked Mr. Fussy. "Oh, I don't know," grinned Mr. Clumsy. "Few days, week, year, haven't decided." Mr. Fussy groaned another long, silent groan to himself. And they went to bed. When he woke in the morning, Mr. Fussy jumped out of bed and went into his bathroom. Oh no, he gasped. "Oh, no!" Oh, yes. Mr. Clumsy had been there before him. The towels lay in a heap on the floor. The bath was full of water. There were pools of water all over the bathroom floor. Half a tube of toothpaste had been squeezed out onto the mirror. What a mess! Mr. Fussy made it all neat and tidy as quickly as he could. Then he hurried downstairs. "Morning," said his cousin cheerfully. "I've cooked your breakfast. Sit down." There was an awful mess everywhere. "There we are. Breakfast," said Mr. Clumsy, carrying a plate of fried eggs, broken fried eggs, towards the table. And then he tripped over those shoelaces of his, and then the eggs flew through the air, and they landed all over Mr. Fussy. Sticky, greasy, yellow, fried eggs. "Whoops," said Mr. Clumsy. After a week, Mr. Fussy's house didn't look like Mr. Fussy's house anymore. Don't you agree? But after 2 weeks, Mr. Clumsy decided to move on. "Oh, thanks for having me, sport," he said to Mr. Fussy. "It was very nice to see you," replied Mr. Fussy politely. What he was thinking was not so polite. "It's very nice to see you going," was what he was thinking. "Well, cheerio," said Mr. Clumsy. And off he went with his battered old suitcase. "Goodbye," thought Mr. Fussy, really meaning good riddance. Then Mr. Fussy fussed round his house as he'd never fussed before. Fussy old fusspot. That evening, Mr. Fussy was in his kitchen, polishing an egg, and he heard a crash outside. "Oh, no," he groaned. "Oh, not Mr. Clumsy back again. It can't be. It isn't." And it wasn't. It was somebody else. Somebody who just walked straight through Mr. Fussy's garden gate. Somebody who can't help having little accidents. Somebody you may have met before. "Hello," smiled Mr. Bump. "I've come to visit. I thought I'd bump into you again sometime. Bump into you. Mr. Uppity was one of the rudest people in the world, if not the rudest. He was rude to anybody and everybody. So, of course, in Big Town, which is where he lived, he had no friends at all. Not one. "Miserable old Uppity," they used to call him, and he certainly looked it. Now, as well as being rude, Mr. Uppity was also rich. Very rich. One of the richest people in the world, if not the richest. He had the largest, longest limousine in Big Town. He had the largest, longest garden in Big Town. He had, on the top of a hill in the middle of Big Town, the most enormous house. The biggest house in Big Town. And there he lived, all alone. Miserable old Uppity. One day, Mr. Uppity was walking in the gardens of his enormous house, when suddenly he heard a voice. "Hello," said the voice. Mr. Uppity looked, and there, in one of his hundreds of flower beds, was a goblin. "Are you not going to say hello to me?" said the goblin. "Go away," said Mr. Uppity rudely. "Oh, I know who you must be," said the goblin. "You must be Mr. Uppity, who's rude to everybody." Sniffed Mr. Uppity rudely. "Well, I know somebody who wants to meet you," said the goblin, and he skipped off, the way goblins do. Mr. Uppity's curiosity got the better of him. He followed. "In there," said the goblin, pointing at a small hole in a tree. "Don't be silly," snorted Mr. Uppity. Oh, I'm not being silly," said the goblin. "Yes, you are," snapped Mr. Uppity. "I can't possibly